Good morning, everybody. Actually, good afternoon, depending on where you are. And welcome to this Region Cities Industry Webinar series organized by the Regional Studies Association. The title is very long. Let's just try to summarize a bit what is the general theme today. Nothing new under the sun. We have shocks, as we all know now, and trends, and this is what has always happened in human history. We have just been reminded about how vulnerable the world is to shocks through COVID-19. But if we think about it, actually, you know, there were still places and lots of people trying to cope and come to terms with the previous shocks, the 2008 economic and financial crisis. And so shocks change the world, and sometimes for a very, very long time, prompting new needs, new questions, new priorities, setting new priorities. On the other hand, these shocks obviously occur in the context of mega trends, including globalization, economic globalization, technological change, shift of paradigms that transform and shape the way we live and provide also new opportunities for development, for growth more generally. However, these same global megatrends can also be very controversial and highly divisive. So interacting with shocks at the same time, we see huge challenges for social, economic equity, cohesion, sustainability, and even peace. I mean, it's something that we feel nowadays. So we know that history matters. We always known as social scientists, obviously, that is a very important way to look at phenomena. And we know also that history is very geographically specific at all layers of geography, from macro region to nation to regions and local places. Shocks are also spatially asymmetric, and trends have very heterogeneous impact on places, as we all know. So the aim today is to discuss what can we learn from history, right? What do we know from history or not, right? Is the present different from the past, and how? We have three very distinguished speakers. Dr. Joaquim Oliveira Martins from the OECD. He will address the nature of crisis, what history could tell us about COVID-19 in particular, and reflect on disruptive changes and new opportunities that can stem from a sort of creative destruction effects of shocks. Then we have Dr. Sergio Petralia, Utrecht University, and he will talk about interregional inequality and technological change, a big theme, looking at how theoretical approaches to inequality tend to lead or not to more individual and regional inequality. Last but not least, Professor Elisa Giuliani, University of Pisa, starting from history, she will address people's cognitive frames, narratives, ideologies. I'm particularly glad to see this word, ideology, back into the picture, on shocks, highlighting the possibility of their change and future scenarios. And then we'll have possibly, and actually very likely, lots of questions from the public. So I leave the floor to Dr. Joaquim Oliveira Martins.
Thank you very much, Simona, and I'm so happy to be today with you and with Sergio and Elisa. At the OECD, we have been sort of following, of course, these developments, and I sort of noticed that there is a bit two ways of seeing what's happening. So a first sort of approach is that basically this was a totally exogenous shock to the economy, And basically, if we'll do the right things, the economy could get back to normal afterwards. So this is a sort of a Keynesian view of the world, and the kind of the macro view that goes with that. So basically, the policy responses, if you are in this kind of approach, basically is to sustain income of people and allow enterprises to remain alive, either by giving grants or loans. So in the what people have encapsulated is help or act now and check later. But there is another view, and the other view is a bit this idea that any crisis brings structural change and consequences. So perhaps a more Aikian view of the world, which is more micro based. So in this view, people start immediately talking about a reallocation of capital. What is the role of exit and entry mechanisms? What about our capacity to deal with this wave of bankruptcies which is ahead of us? Could we have a more strategic view on the way we actually do this, implement this support to the enterprises, this kind of liquidity short-term support? Could this support be sort of oriented to kind of the accompaniment of these structural trends? Sort of ideas around what we call smart conditionality. For example, you could give some support to the enterprises, providing that, for example, they use this part of the support to adopt sort of a stronger digital technologies. So the idea that basically this crisis could also be an accelerator of certain sort of mega trends, like you said. So of course, digitalization, but also how this crisis could be sort of joined up with all the discussion about the energy climate transition. So we know that these two views are often a bit difficult to reconcile. So this is the whole discussion about micro foundations of macroeconomics, etc. So even from the policy point of view, it's not easy, of course, to both support in the short term, this is sort of emergency mode, and at the same time start reflecting about the long term, the structural change. So let me say something about these two approaches. So the first approach has been sort of dominant, because government started, of course, they understood the urgency, they understood the magnitude of the shock. So we are talking about a sort of a shock. So the OECD, the figures that are still on the table is this 2-3% of the decrease in GDP per month of confinement. So basically we'll end up at the end of the year with a fall in GDP in the very close or even in the sort of two-digit type sort of area. And this say fall of 10% of GDP, or perhaps between 5 and 10% of GDP, depending on the countries, that can even more, would translate, of course, into a pressure which is more equivalent in terms of the public deficits, and how these public deficits are going to be financed basically by an increase of public debts. And of course, this increase of public debts is easier in some countries than others, but my country, Portugal or Greece, Italy, may be countries that face some difficulties in financing these increased deficits. So up to now, central banks are sort of allowing for this increased debt to function by buying public debts in the secondary market. This keeps interest rates very low. So in some sense, these debts are sustainable because the debt service, the serving of this debt, because of very low real interest rates, is sort of is possible. But at the same time, if you introduce in this first approach sort of a more structural view, is that this very low in real interest rates is not very good news, right? This means that perhaps agents are anticipating a stagnation ahead of us, right? And so this raises immediately the issue of productivity, and perhaps an excessive, I would say, focus on capital gains or valorization of capital rather than productive investments. Clearly, even if we may feel that this budget constraint on public finance is not perhaps immediate, I'm sure that in a sort of more intertemporal basis, there is a public budget constraint. So on the second view, which is a bit more structural, this more kind of Aikian view of the world, so what kind of structural change may emerge out of this crisis? Emerge or accelerate? So And let's see what kind of changes may actually have an impact to the kind of policies we are dealing with. So urban, regional, rural policies. First of all, what people talk about is really digitalization. So this is clearly an opportunity to a strong diffusion of these digital technologies. Perhaps at the end, we may see even some impact on total factor productivity. This kind of a solo paradox, where is ICT in our TFP statistics may finally actually emerge because of this very strong sort of diffusion opportunity. We know, for example, SMEs, which are the backbone of our economies, 60, 70% of employment, are sort of enterprises that often do not have this uptake of digital technologies. A huge gap between the adoption of digital technologies by large firms and by small firms. Things like, for example, like online selling. I'm not seeing any SME now being viable without sort of a possibility for online selling. Use of cloud computing, for example. Something that was very, very sort of the uptake of this cloud computing, which is a sort of inclusive technology, the uptake was extremely sort of low. So also the whole agenda of reskilling of the labor force. So the OECD, for example, has produced statistics on the risk of automation at the regional level, and you see there are huge differences across regions. The second structural feature that may emerge out of this crisis is this idea of density as an advantage. We are regional urban economies, so this issue of density is our main focus. This is what creates these differences across regions. So you may see the emergence of a sort of an urban penalty. Of course, this urban penalty will depend on the virus. We don't know what the virus will be in the next months. People discuss about the second wave. People talk about how to reconcile a deconfinement with social distancing. So we don't know yet, but this urban penalty may emerge. So there may be a change in this kind of spatial equilibrium because of the penetration, for example, of teleworking or distributed remote working. So this is something that clearly could rebalance a bit this spatial equilibrium between large cities and the rest of the cities. Could we replace physical by digital proximity? Could we replace physical hubs, large physical hubs like large cities by digital hubs? So all this may require a re-engineering of cities, a very good connection discussion between planners and economists on spatial planning, how to design public spaces, how to allow for this social distance. How can we resync sort of events in cities like culture or sports events? And of course, this also may generate some interesting opportunities for the low density areas. So I'm not talking about necessarily about rural, but just low density areas. And perhaps this may actually help to address some of these issues related to what we call the geography of discontent. So we know these trends about distributed manufacturing, the localization of services, but of course we need to address the digital divide that currently exists between, say, cities and the other areas. The other trends, the other structural features that this crisis may bring is, of course, this idea of revisiting globalization. In 2008 crisis, the global trade declined by almost 10%. We are now ahead of something, if not equivalent, even bigger, and could be even bigger. Could be even go at minus 20 or more % of world trade. And this, of course, this is also accompanied with these protectionist pressures that were already there before this crisis. So this is the whole discussion about industrial policy. I think we need to be extremely careful. Our economists are always a bit doubtful about industrial policies, but I think a smart way of doing industrial policy is to connect it with regional policy. So all these issues about smart specialization, perhaps a better use of global value chains at regional level. Another structural trend, which I think is very important, and is the last one, is how to combine what is going on with this decarbonization, energy, climate transition. So adaptation of cities. Low energy prices could be, of course, bad because this makes renewable energy less competitive, but at the same price, at the same time, with lower energy prices, actually, it will be easier to implement carbon taxes. So, you know, in France, all these issues about, you know, the implementation of a carbon tax. So this could, in some sense, be associated with increased preferences towards public goods. So we have the green economy, also perhaps a greater role for the social economy, and also in the health system, perhaps a seek for a stronger resilience of our health systems, where up to now perhaps the health systems were very focused on actually efficiency. So you know, cutting spending, etc. And we see interesting sort of a discussion about the role of decentralization of health systems in the creation of a stronger and more efficient health system. So this is a kind of my first thought. Then I would also like to bring more issues about the role of urban, rural, and regional policies in all this. But perhaps I would leave that for the Q&A sort of a part of this discussion. So the role of regional policies, the role of subnational governments, the issues about the decentralization, subnational finances, I think are very important. But I will leave that for the second part. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joaquim. It's been a very big, you know, lots of issues at stakes and possibly lots of questions coming. And now we have Sergio. Sergio, the floor is yours.
Perfect. So the topic I'm going to be centered today, but not exclusively discussing, is interregional inequality and technological change. But first, before starting with the topic, let me first thank the wonderful colleagues that I have at LSE, Growth Lab, and Utrecht University that helped me a lot, that they are a source of inspiration, and also funding, like the ERC project of Riccardo Crescenzi, that was also part, that contributed a lot in this idea. So this idea of the discussion being centered around international inequality, but not exclusively so, it gets very clear in the structure of the presentation I want to give, in which I will focus a lot more on the context and why I think this is an interesting problem for us as regional scientists, for the community. And then I will devote some part of it to thinking about what we are doing in terms of the role of technological change. I first would like to discuss or to situate the discussion in a very, very broad context in which inequality and decreases and increases of it have been associated with many different theories or many different ways in which this phenomena could be explained. Going from how stages of development can lead to higher or lower inequality, to how the boom in globalization was previously discussed by Joaquim, could lead to higher or lower inequality, and many others in which technological change is just a part of it, and where skill-biased technological change is perhaps the main theory behind it. So, but I will come back to that later, because this will become important at the conclusion part. So let me tell you why I think this is important, and I will give you four reasons why I think we should be studying in our community this problem. More in general, let's say inequality, interregional and interregional. Because since the last 40 years, the inequality, interpersonal inequality in general, but other sources of inequality have been increasing after a long period, perhaps more than 40 years of decrease of this inequality. So this is what you see here in this slide is an updated version of the graph that you could find in Saez and Piketty 2011, I think, or 2013, where you see how much of the income share in the United States is possessed or goes to the top 10% income people. So it's a quite striking path, dynamics. It follows a U-shaped relationship, but quite really strong and worsening off in the last 40 years. But this calls for the discussion of why this is an interesting problem. But I would like to emphasize that this is also an interesting problem for us in our community, because this is not only happening at the interpersonal level, it's happening at the intra-place level and the interplace level. Here, what you see on the right-hand side of this graph is, instead of income, wages. And what you see is the Gini coefficient, intra-Gini coefficient and inter-Gini coefficient when you look at commuting zones in the United States in terms of wage inequality. So here, one doesn't mean that there is perfect inequality because everything is centered around 1940 as a base year, where things started to go down, or where we have the first data point, actually. So this, okay, this is an interesting problem for us. And it's not also an interesting problem for us because it's happening somewhere around the world, like in the US, where we know inequality is a big problem, but it's happening in places in which there are active policies against this problem. So we know Europe is very proactive in terms of how to deal with this inequality. And nevertheless, you see that the regional income distribution of European regions has shifted to the left. Meaning that now we have more unequal and fatter lower tails in terms of income distributions across places. So that is, again, on top of the other problems, is something that concerns us because we live in this part of the world. But not only because it's happening here, because these things have really important consequences. Andres Rodriguez Posse has been discussing this for a couple of years already. And I dropped here a YouTube recording of him because I think it's super interesting about the Great Divide that he has been working about for many years already, in which he sees these poor development prospects and the no future that some people think they have in these left behind places as triggering something like a revolt against the status quo that may lead to something perhaps undesirable, right? So that's something you can agree or not. I know Simona in which part she stands, but yeah, you may be concerned about this. So this is another reason. So this is happening. It's happening here. May have long-term consequences. So what we are doing here, or the take I want to give you or introduce to you is, or how we think about this problem with some colleagues. My dear colleagues from LSE and Queen Mary University, Michael Storper and Tom Kemeny, is how to think of technological change as a driver of inequality, perhaps intra, perhaps inter, and what can we learn about that? So this is very preliminary work I'm going to show you. And what we decided, or you may ask, why do you want to dig into these ideas if there is already prior work, like the skill bias technological change literature that we already mentioned, which is quite extensive, and some work by Neil Lee and Andres Rodriguez Posse from LSE. Well, because we think these theories are missing something very important. And in particular, they are missing, or they fail to accommodate a world in which inequality has been showing an U-shaped relationship over time, while technological change has been only increasing in the last 100 years, let's say, but let's put as a benchmark the last 60 or 70 years. So these previous theories or empirical evidence can explain the later part of the world, the divergence in incomes, but cannot explain the other one. So what we are trying to think is how we can explain part of these increases and decreases in inequality as having to do with how tacit and disruptive technologies have been concentrating or delocalizing over time. So what we see is, what we initially see right now is that there is a synchrony between these movements over time in income inequality and how these tacit technologies have been concentrating until the 1980s and, deconcentrated, delocalizing until the 1980s and concentrating again. And we argue that this has to do with the need for this type of technologies or the need that how much interaction and how much collocation they need from part of the actors, such as firms or people. So what you see in the graphs B and C, which are accompanying graphic A, are on the y-axis. You always see measures of concentration. So basically, Gini coefficient over space, and also tail and coefficient of variation. So regarding of how you measure this, we see these patterns. So of course, the interesting part for us is, or what took most of our time or effort, is how to define these tacit and disruptive technologies. So basically, in this work we are doing, we are trying to, well, or actually we are reading the entire set of patent documents in the United States, reading the words that they are using, then parsing all this information and understanding the extent of codification of the words technologies are using by relating these words to the entire Google corpora. So we are again using the more than 8 million books and over 500 billion words in the entire Google corpora, all the books that have ever been digitalized since the 1500s, to see how codified are different concepts, and then based on that, understand tacitness as the absence of codification. We also use measures of disruptiveness of technologies based on some work that I've been doing, and now is going to be published in Research Policy, based on the ideas on general purpose technologies. But then again, this is our take, what we think about the problem, how we are trying to deal with this problem. But I would like to go in the conclusion, not to a description of what we are doing or the impact they may have, but also to think a little bit more about the opportunities for our community, because I think that we only have taken point number 5, and all the other points are actually really, really interested to look into in a regional perspective. I haven't been done so. For instance, just from the top of my mind, how the story of Kuznets between stages of development and inequality can be as well a story of, or is actually, from my point of view, a story from the shift from rural to urban activity, and the shift from agriculture to manufacturing, which could be also related to the shift nowadays from manufacturing to services. I know a lot of you have been working on these topics. And this would be something really interesting to know that I don't know so much about, and I would like to know how it impacts. But not only itself from a research perspective, also in terms of policy. In this committee, we know a lot about smart specialization, and we have worked a lot on understanding how different technologies, or how the probability of the emergence of different technologies in different regions can be affected, or how this can be chosen such that we maximize that probability. However, I think we don't have such an extensive understanding of how these policies that we are fostering or promoting can affect inequality. For instance, we assume that this will reduce inter-regional inequality, but there are not so many studies that we could, especially as many as the other ones, that could give us some hint about that. Also, what we don't know so much about how these smart specialization policies could affect intra-place inequality. That would be something super interesting to know from my perspective. And I know you are the community who can provide that answers. So that's something I would really like to see. And I think this is my last slide. So let me thank again all you guys present here, that I think we are more than 200. The RSA Association for inviting me. I'm very happy to be contributing to this. And of course, again, to all my colleagues that contributed to this.
Thank you very much, Sergio. Thank you very much. It's fantastic charts, actually, and they are always very effective. You know, a chart might explain much more than detailed statistics. Sometimes it's very, very good. And now we have Elisa. So Elisa, the floor is yours for a third perspective.
Good afternoon, everybody. So let me start, in the interest of time, with it doesn't work. Okay, so I want to start this talk by showing you a recent piece that came on the press where the journalist compares the COVID crisis with the 1665 bubonic plague in the UK, in England, arguing that there has been no change. Both crises hit the poor much more than they hit the rich, and therefore hinting at the fact that we haven't learned much and things haven't changed worldwide so substantially over the last 400 years. I shall go back to this. Let me say that the COVID crisis, along with other health-related crises, is just one of a wider portfolio of what are known as global sustainability grand challenges, which of course include issues about environmental threats, the organization of production, about which we know a lot, that draws on and is connected to problems of modern slavery, as well as the way in which we deal with tax havens. Now, all these diverse challenges have something in common. We know scientifically a lot about them. There is knowledge about them. Scientific research has advanced substantially to inform us about these threats, about these challenges. We have refined methods and data, and also scientists and analysts are giving or have given us a lot of suggestions about how to deal with these threats, how to solve them, how to address them or minimize their harmful impacts. And yet, responses by the government or the relevant decision makers have been very slow, fragmented, uncoordinated, and thus largely ineffective. So just to make you a few examples, we knew about the COVID crisis, the COVID potentiality for pandemic, and yet we knew that before it happened, and that the world was taken completely unprepared. We have been known about the perils of the climate change crisis already since the 1970s. And again, we are dealing with it. We are not yet found a way out of it. Since the 60s, we know about the existence of a specific class of pesticide known as persistent organic pollutants that are very dangerous for human beings and for the ecosystems. And yet it has taken us nearly 40 years to get to a global treaty, which is imperfectly implemented across countries. Again, we know about modern slavery now. There's a lot of research on that. We know that there's some data may not be accurate, but we know there's some 60 million people working in the slavery condition in the private economy currently, and yet a few countries in the world have taken any steps to solve or address this problem. And finally, we know a lot about the problems engendered by tax havens and the fact that the contribution rate of business to governments has gone down, and we have not yet managed to work at the avoidance of tax avoidance. So all these stories show that these responses are slow, fragmented, again, uncoordinated across geographies, and this weakens, of course, their efficacy. These are global threats and require a global action. We also have to easily accept the idea that by exploiting such regulatory voids across geographies, companies with a global outreach can be profitable and generate economic returns, also and economic impacts also in the host countries in the forms of more jobs, better jobs, higher income. And this has somehow provided a moral justification for such regulatory voids to exist. And the nominal narrative has been that such voids are a necessary evil for economic growth. Now, the point that I want to make here is that the acceptance of these regulatory voids as a necessary evil is not set in stone. And particularly the pace in which decision makers address sustainability challenges does not depend on fixed and inviolable economic rules. It rather, and this is what I want to bring today here, it depends on decision makers' cognitive frames and the dominant narratives that are constructed around given topic, which condition ideologies and thus lead to the acceptance of certain truths, unitary truths actually, and to the rejections of others, may be equally valid or even better other truths. So research done in psychology, linguistics and strategic change, among others, shows that cognitive frames, that is the way in which individuals make sense of the complex world around them, shape action. They have a performative role. So to change something, you need to change first the framing of how people understand the reality around them. And we know that in the context of sustainability in particular, it is very hard for these cognitive frames to shift. That is, it's very hard to promote a change, precisely because that implies radical departures from comfort zones. It requires accepting ambiguities and paradoxes, which most decision makers are not willing to take. For instance, we have not yet come to the acceptance of the very simple idea that sometimes you have to sacrifice, in the short term at least, some economic gains to save lives or the planet. So we are trapped in these narratives which are possibly leading us nowhere because we haven't been able to solve important problems about which we know a lot. Luckily, there's always the option that narratives will change in the future, that even the most resilient narratives can change. And with that in mind, I've looked at, and what I think is an interesting phenomenon during the COVID crisis, which is the narrative around, that has been built recently around bailout conditionalities. That is, the conditions that firms have to satisfy to be awarded support by the government in the face of the crisis, especially with references to large firms. So by looking at the press, I've seen three types of narratives emerging. One, which I call the distributive justice narrative, points at the fact that you cannot support companies that have that are registered in tax havens, or that distributes dividends and bonuses to their shareholders and executives. And I call it the Piketty, the Thomas Piketty narrative, because it's evocative of some of his key points in the research that is done and he popularizes. The second one is the climate justice argument. So you have to take the crisis, and Oliveira was mentioning it before, as an opportunity for changing, transforming the economies towards becoming more sustainable from a ecological point of view and environmental point of view, and therefore you can take this opportunity to condition bailouts to the attainment of given climate targets. I call it, for simplicity, the Greta Thunberg narrative. And then by looking at the press, which perhaps is normal at time of crisis, I also observed a more aggressive anti-capitalistic narrative coming up, which I called improperly, and I apologize for to Marx already, the Karl Marx narrative itself. So what I've done is essentially I've run an automated content analysis using non-overlapping dictionaries meant to capture the three narratives, and looked at the international press in English during the crisis. Most of the discussion on the bailout conditionalities have started in the early March. And as you can see from this graph, the distributive justice narrative is given more credit, and increasingly so over time. And only at the end of the period of observation, it has somehow alternated with a more radical Marxist narrative, whereas the Greta Thunberg climate change narrative is there, but remains really less relevant and remains less prominently, is less prominent essentially. I would also like to mention that over this period of observation, the hate language in the press, that is language that expresses anger, is not increasing. On the contrary, if at all, it is decreasing. So that shows that the way we talk about these issues and about conditionalities is not out of pure angry anti-capitalistic jargon, but it reflects a different narrative that I think is more concrete in terms of finding feasible solutions, okay? And it's, so the distributive justice narrative is not just critical, it is based on solid recent evidence. Sergio was just talking about it in the previous presentation. And it seems to be that if these narratives become more pervasive and get reinforced, they could lead to some shift in the cognitive frames and in the willingness of people to accept the idea that you can siphon off economic resources from where they get abnormally accumulated to transfer them to address pressing sustainability problems. So to me, that's a sign of hope. In fact, it was quite striking for me to see that these narratives came from the mouth of very moderate politicians or press outlets and not from the mouth of anti-globalization campaigners themselves. So it seems that something that seems so radical, or been seen radical perhaps 6 months ago, is becoming more accepted, at least it is as it is portrayed by the general press. And this could be like the seeds of a new narrative, or the starting of a long journey. It clearly remains to be seen whether these narratives will consolidate, that it will last, or it will fade away with the end of the COVID crisis. And also, again, whether this will spread geographically. I've looked at the literature, at the press, international press in English. So clearly it remains to be seen whether this framing of this problem is going to be similar in other countries that are not English speaking, and clearly what is the geography of that, and how that language or that narrative can be transformed across geographies, or will transform across geographies. I think this leaves up, gives a lot of food for thought for understanding the next years, and how we can find a solution to this crisis, but also to the other grand sustainability challenges that we still have to address. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to the three speakers. And I think that here we do not have a problem of food for thought. I mean, I really don't know how to where to start with questions that come to my mind. I will actually give priority to the public, and I have already questions coming up a lot. So in the interest of the time, maybe each of the speakers should, handle a question, because it's impossible to have the three overviews on each question. So I think the first one I have is possibly more directed to Joaquim. So these trends, okay, I mean, opportunities were present before the crisis, well before the crisis. And the point is perhaps to understand what is the accelerator effects that you have mentioned in your presentation. What are accelerated policies to put in place, right? I mean, if we think about the ICT revolution, there is a lot of literature pointed to its equalization effect, and we see that that has not happened.
Okay, thanks, Simona. I think, yeah, there is several questions by Maria, Elisa, and Maria de Conceição, from a compatriot, on this issue of a crisis as an accelerator, also the issue of cities versus other regions. So it's true that this crisis could accelerate certain trends, and we discussed already about digitalization. This is obvious, I think, to me, that this crisis will make the business case for a stronger uptake of digital technologies much stronger. I remember in Rome last year in a big conference on SMEs, and we were talking about these digital trends, and the people were saying there, okay, this is very important, but for a lot of SMEs in service sectors and restaurants, stuff like that, this is not yet there. This is a bit the future, right? Well, the future is now. So the businesses that had access to these technologies and could indeed, for example, use in an efficient way online, sort of selling and others, they had an edge. So this is clearly on the climate change. I think it's perhaps another discussion, but the one on the advantages of density and cities, I think there is a break. Because in the past, and this discussion is about the past and the future, right? So in the past, it's true that cities were exposed to tremendous shock. Even during wars, they are completely destroyed. And you have the impression that these urban systems are extremely resilient, right? And there were in the past these sort of diseases in cities, etc. And cities, in some sense, survived and adapted and continued. But I think now there is something which is completely different, is the availability of these digital technologies. I think this, it's my opinion, but I think this is a break vis-a-vis the past. So now we have at our disposal technologies that indeed reduce these benefits of agglomeration and density. So, you know, in Paris, for example, in the inner Paris, there is 20-25% of the people that during the confinement went to the countryside. You know that in Paris now, there is a visible, very visible increase of prices for houses in the periphery. So I think, you know, we are economic geographers. We deal with the urban economics. This notion of spatial equilibrium is a very important one to us. So this spatial equilibrium is driven by a trade-off, right? Between transportation costs, proximity to work, access to jobs. So I know it doesn't seem impossible to me that people now trade off, you know, this proximity, the benefits of this proximity to jobs, to more space that allow for teleworking. For example, a lot of families in Paris were in some sense hindered in the possibility to do teleworking because they are in small, confined spaces with kids around. So this created sort of a lot of difficulties. So these people now want more space. And if they want more space, they have to go outside from the sort of the core of cities and go to the periphery. Perhaps not to the rural areas, but at least to the periphery. So this, it seems to me, indeed something that could be a break vis-a-vis the past in terms of this sort of a specific advantages of cities in terms of agglomeration economies. Now, there is also the question that was raised by Maria de Conceição on this rural-urban sort of a migration. So could we see something in a sufficient scale to modify the patterns of occupation, say, in rural areas vis-a-vis sort of a large cities? So that's a very big question. But clearly, there was already some things, you know, this notion that the world could become flatter has been, of course, we all know this has been, you know, discussed for now decades, and we actually didn't see it at all. We see, on the contrary, more and more of this agglomeration and concentration going on. But still, you know, things like this distributed manufacturing, as I said, all the ideas, you know, of Richard Baldwin about the delocalization of services, these ideas about globotics, I think this could create some advantages for the lower density areas. And clearly, if you have enough of these people, you know, moving to lower density areas, then if you have also, of course, addressing the digital divide, this is very important. And also the provision of certain public services like education and health, yes, indeed, this could perhaps lead to perhaps a lower pressure in terms of this trends towards concentration. I think this is important for OECD countries, of course, but it's perhaps particularly important for emerging markets and developing countries, because
okay, Joaquim, I have to stop you here because I have hundreds of questions. So I will select myself the question, being the chair, and try to divide a bit the workload between you, right? So there is one of the first question was, and I would like this to be answered by Sergio. Could you elaborate more on regional inequality and smart specialization with respect to technological change? That is, shortly, what is your view on this, Sergio?
Okay, very shortly. So I can elaborate, but this elaboration will not be about answers, but questions. Yeah. Actually, so basically, the point I'm trying to think about is, where I see the discourse of smart specialization, one of its main objectives behind it is also to reduce this regional divide, to create a way in which we could create a sort of convergence between regions by allowing them to diversify into sectors that are more technologically advanced for them, and that could lead, you know, to higher value added, many benefits. So on the one hand, this smart specialization theory and policy implementation is structurally based on the notion of reducing inequality. However, most of the results that we see in the literature are more oriented on how to do it. And I would like to know more results on what are the impact of the things we do. And to give you a short example, and caricature example, very like toy example. Imagine you ask a region to diversify in a very high-tech sector that they are capable to do, no problem about that. That can trigger a set of dynamics in the inequality within that place that may lead for that region to catch up, while the inequality within that place may be more higher over time, because you will be fueling that region with a lot of very highly skilled and very well paid professionals, while some of this existing structure perhaps will remain at low wages. So how that happens, when, in which situations, these are questions that I cannot answer, and I would like to know. So that's it's more of a motivation than, you know, I cannot give you answers about that, but I would like to see, and I know most of you know how to do that. That's why I'm calling for you to do.
You know, Sergio, the purpose of also this webinar is also to launch new, you know, precisely food for thought and research lines. So I have a question that was one of the first for Elisa, actually. I would like Elisa to better resilience to the COVID crisis, right? From homeschooling to working from home seems to be linked to better access to technology. Is the COVID crisis accelerating technological change by creating a more accepting demand? So, I mean, is the link between technological change and also, you know, public perception and reaction?
I have a few answers for the questions that were strictly on my talk.
Yeah, but just, you know, I mean, if you have a perception as like mothers homeschooling and, you know.
I mean, there's Joaquim was suggesting that this crisis is teaching us that we need more distant smart working, and that we have the technologies to do that, but we still, you know, don't allow that. I think it's a matter of a political will and decision what will come. If we will think that this we will have more pandemic like this one, and we think digitalization is key, then I think there would be more intention or interest for policymakers to really target that. I don't think this is a very contested terrain, I have to say. I mean, it's just a matter of putting the resources, and it makes sense because it can be good for even though there is no pandemic. I think there are other domains that are much more contested that came up with the crisis, and where instead policy response is not going to be at all obvious, and where we need really to be worried about much more. But you don't want me to pick up on that.
Right. Okay, quickly then, again, Joaquim, I mean, it's very difficult to select here. We have what can region do between the long-term structural change needed and the immediate aid? Shortly.
First of all, and I think governments, regional governments have done a lot. So at the beginning, it's true that in some sense the policy response was space blind, was uniform, but very quickly I think this role of geography sort of emerged. Support to fragile, disadvantaged population, young people, migrants, informal workers, self-employed. All these things are very difficult to target in a sort of an upper level, in a very uniform sort of basis. You need more sort of a specific, more granular information. Subnational governments were extremely sort of rapid in some sense, or of complementing all the measures taken at the central level with this more granular sort of policy approach. Managing, for example, the deconfinement with social distance, this is typically an urban policy, cannot be decided sort of on a sort of a central government level. the support to the SMEs also. I think at the subnational level, a lot of cities and regions have helping in some sense SMEs even to understand the kind of policy support that was put at their disposal by the central governments. Also, I think all the area in a sort of more structural manner, all the areas of skills and the support to environmental transition. You know, a lot of skills policies actually are in the hands of regional governments, are not anymore in the hands of sort of central governments. So all this makes that in some sense, this complementarity, this coordination, this alignment, this sort of a joint up work between central, regional and local governments was very important to deal with the crisis and to deal with the sort of more long-term issues. Now, the big question, Simona, is indeed, as some people has raised in the questions, the level of coordination. Because what happened again in 2008, if you look at the past, what happened in 2008 is there was a very big stimulus at the beginning done by central governments, but actually at the subnational level, regional and national and the sort of local governments did exactly the opposite. Why they did the opposite? Because there was a decrease in revenues and increase in expenditures, notably social expenditures, and they could not go into deficits or go into debt. So what they did? They cut public investment. And of course, most of the public investment is done by subnational governments. 60% or more of public investment at the national level is done by subnational governments. So I think this is a very important sort of a point, because we need public investment. All these things we are talking about, the digitalization, addressing the digital sort of divide, the transition to a low carbon economy, a lot of these things will require public investment. So if this public investment will be cut because subnational governments don't have the capacity to address this sort of pressures between lowering revenues and increasing expenditures, this will have a very damaging effect. As you know, in 2008, Simona, there was a collapse in Europe of public investment. So I think this is a very important one. Yeah. And of course calls for a very strong...
I have to stop you again. Yeah, no, I agree completely, but I want Sergio to follow up on this. One of the public asked, I would like to know which is the role you foresee for the public sector in the redistribution of wealth and wages. So how do you think that redistribution measure a la Piketty would work? Sergio.
I had the chat open, sorry. Yes, I think that is really a difficult question, because to be honest, I don't really know. That's something I wrote down to ask Joaquim and Elisa, because redistribution, I mean, if you think of these policies, I can only think at the moment of policies related to the redistribution of innovative activities that had to do with the interregional and the way I was thinking about the problem. But then again, to be honest, I think I'm not the one that is most qualified to answer this particular question, because all these redistribution policies are perhaps oriented on as we said, on shifting money to regions and to activate technological policies, or policies are aimed at technological development and technological diversification. And that is a very important channel, I would say, that now, given the crisis, perhaps is getting discontinued. And then we, you know, it's also a good opportunity for us to understand how, you know, you have a kind of an experiment in which there is a pandemic and some of these technologically oriented policies are being shut down, perhaps differently across region because governments implement it differently. So we could see how the technological development works in places when you shut down these initiatives. So that could be a way of thinking, you know, what is the value of the public sector in one policy, public policy that I think is more related to what I've been discussing. In the other ones, I actually brought the same to Elisa. Perhaps she can take over in the sense that, you know, all these narratives and that she was mentioning in the Piketty initiative how this really actually have an effect. That's what I would like to know. Do you see, Elisa, for instance, these initiatives, cutting dividends, as something that may bring about more equality at the very end? I'm very skeptical about that.
Actually, there are lots of questions for all of you, but there is a question precisely connecting with that for Elisa. So what happened to the evolution of the dominant narrative during the last few months? You know, I mean, these dominant narratives are still very powerful, like, you know, and this perception, actually, this is also my own question to you, Elisa, this perception that they are changing. Yes, you got it from the press in your wonderful exercise, but isn't that still a sort of broad ivory tower kind of reaction that is not spread around the general population?
Okay, so I'll try to answer these questions, and there's a few more that concern, so I will give one answer.
Yeah.
So first of all, this is very preliminary work that I'm doing, and I haven't analyzed the dominant narrative, but I plan to do so, as well as combine the various narratives together. There might be some interesting overlaps, and definitely I wouldn't expect the dominant narratives to just fade away in a couple of months. I mean, it's very strong, but to me, it's interesting that there is some signal that even you know, I would say more moderate press or the general press is depicting or talking or framing this discourse, which I think is quite radical. I go to, before I go to the answers, let me say something. I mean, with the evidence that we have on the environmental climate change, on human rights violations connected to the business sectors and so on, we know, because this is being measured now, that we have sacrificed in a way environmental rights or human rights in the name of economic growth. And that has been done not out of bad or evil minds. It's just that it was based on the idea in which it's grounded the idea that governments collect taxes from firms, from companies that are the cause of those harms, and they, with those taxes, can clean up their harms. Okay, so that was how it functioned. That has been functioning for many years. But then we have been noticing in the last 30 years or so that the contribution rate of companies to government has gone down. There's World Bank data on this, and that's, you know, not surprising, because as the group of Piketty, Guzman, and others have shown, a lot of this money is hidden in tax haven. Okay, so there is tax evasion and there is tax avoidance, which is perfectly legal. So we, in this changing environment, we need to account for that. We cannot just deal with the harmful impact of companies as they were negative externalities, because the world has changed. We need to ask companies to make sure that companies internalize the cost of their harmful business conduct. Okay, because if they don't want to pay the taxes, they need to cover their costs. So whether they pick them from the extra salaries of the executive, or they pick them from the shareholder dividends, I don't care. They should invest firm-wise into addressing the human rights harms or the environmental harms. And this should be a priority for governments, which are still frightened by the fact that they cannot ask such things to companies, and the rhetoric and the dominant narrative would never dare asking. So my point here, in this crisis, maybe temporary, maybe not lasting, but still we are seeing a radicalization of a given reasonable discourse, because I would not consider Piketty an extremist or I don't know. So I would consider him to offer quite solid solutions, at least solid data and solid reasoning. And therefore, I mean, I think we should start the change in narrative. Going to Maria Savona's comment is a first step, right? Because if you see the press discussing these issues while it completely avoided them or used completely other terms to address to these issues. It's on the press that people read, and it might be a long process, but people reading things could rediscuss things. Now, it's not that, it's like, okay, if we go back to history, we are, there might be some need to overthrow the ruling elites, and the ruling elites now are not the landlords, they are the billionaires that have accumulated fortune, sometimes through good entrepreneurship activities, sometimes just through rent seeking. So
thank you.
That is
so, I mean, I'd like also to there is one question that is generally now, I mean, so you can reply as in whichever order, right? I mean, this reaction to countries to COVID-19 has been very, very different, right? We have seen that clearly with the UK, US government, you know, having a completely different approach from the rest of the world, and particularly not looking at the rest of the world. We are seeing that in the UK very clearly. So, I mean, so how do we deal with this? I mean, this, to what extent, the question is, technology has supported this diversity and unfortunately, you know, further reinforce inequality. A global perspective, is it really possible in this kind of scenario that we have seen emerging with the COVID and the replies? Who wants to address this? Oops.
Actually, I don't want to speak too much, but before I address that issue, could I say something on this issue of redistribution?
Oh yeah.
Okay. Okay. Just to complement what Sergio said, because this is a very important issue, because it's true that this crisis revealed huge disparities. So we knew that there are huge regional disparities, but this crisis put a light in some of these disparities. For example, access to healthcare.
Yeah.
The number of hospital beds, we have no statistics on that at the OECD, the number of hospitals bed by region can vary from 1 to 4, for example. Access to, of course, high-speed internet, huge differences. And very low quality of internet in rural areas. In Italy, for example, the government was telling me that 40% of households in Italy don't have actually the computer and ICT equipment to do, for example, teleworking. Also, when you look at the occupations by region, you see that these occupations that are amenable to telework, huge differences across regions. For example, in Paris, 50% of the occupations can be done at distance. If you go to rural regions in France, this thing goes down to 10% or less. So this issue of regional disparity is very important. So the business case for redistribution could be there, in particular because of this crisis. Yeah. Our position at the OECD is that these transfers basically didn't create a lot of development, create more dependence than development. Just pure transfers. And even if people receive a lot of transfers, at the end, they are discontent. They receive money, okay, but they are discontent. So the kind of policy that we advocate in the OECD is kind of the modern regional policy, is a policy that is based on investment rather than transfers. But of course, in order to have investment, you need to have a strategy. And this strategy needs to be, of course, a strategy done by the stakeholders locally. They need to appropriate this strategy. And this is, you know, all the discussion about multi-level governance, the alignment of, so this is a bit our view. Be careful about pure redistributions of policies, because very often, at least in terms of regional disparities, they create often more dependence than actually addressing, you know, the development. Now, in terms of the differentiated strategies by different countries, yes, you are right. But we have a lot of problems making sense of these differences. For example, you see in Sweden a mortality rate much higher than in other countries. Let's say if you compare Norway and Sweden, the mortality rate in Sweden, I think is 240 compared with 40 and something in Norway. So you have the impression that indeed this kind of a different approach generated a much higher mortality. But then we compare the mortality rate in Sweden compared with France. Actually, we have a higher mortality in France than in Sweden. So currently, it's extremely difficult to make sense, actually, of these differences in terms of the, I'm talking about the policies to deal with the health crisis. I'm not talking about the economic policies, of course. So currently is a bit different. And of course, the problem is the uncertainty around all these, because we don't know what the virus will let us to do. This vaccination, a vaccine is something that they take years.
No, it's more, I mean, my worry, if I can say, I mean, this was related more to the change in cognitive frames, in the sense that with these closures, right, sort of entropy at the zone or macro area level, it's very difficult to tackle the issues that also Elisa is talking about, because for some of these issues, such as the superpower of global corporations and all the dimension related to that, you need definitely some kind of very strong supranational also. So at all levels of governance, of regulation, that is going to be effective across borders. Otherwise, you will never win. So
my take on
okay, let's talk Sergio for a second, because we have a very short time, and then Elisa again. Yeah, Sergio.
Yes, no, I just wanted to add on top of what you said, because it was actually something. Let me do a little bit of futurology on what you just said.
Allowed. We allow
because
everything here.
based on my experience as an Argentinian, and I haven't seen many crises in my lifetime, one thing that you surely will see, and I can bet beer to all participants on this, is that we will see after the crisis that we will not be able to recover. We will increase the level of inequalities, and we will start from a higher point. That happened in Argentina. You go worse and you start to recover, but you never go down to the level of equality that you had before, or inequality. So this reversal process that we are going to start in a couple of years will be important, but will take so much time until we can reach the previous level of inequality. So
you mean a lower one, right?
Exactly. So
exactly.
If we were here, we will get here, and then it will take so much time to go back to the previous level, and perhaps we will not reach it in 10 years. So
think about the crisis 2008, right? It's exactly what we were saying before, yeah.
So what does it mean? To me, it means that we will need a lot of intervention, public intervention. That relates to all the other comments we received, what Joaquim was saying, and what Elisa was saying also. We will need a lot of active policies. And even so, we should expect that all the progress that we did in the last 10 years, perhaps in terms of inequality, vanishes in this year. So that is, it's not, I don't want to be pessimistic, but I think that this is something that could happen, and I think it will certainly happen.
Right, Elisa, on this. Elisa?
Yes, quite quick. I mean, of course, global treaties on all these issues are very important. There is tons of global treaties on all different aspects on environmental. So there's many treaties. They work imperfectly, but they work. And I'm not against having global treaties. The point is that if we want, the point is perhaps that if you want voters, and therefore the people that then takes political rights to vote, to really think differently, you need to change the narrative in a way, and to make certain taboos accepted to the wider public, the people that then when they go and vote for people, they have a completely different, the politicians will follow from that, I'm sure, because the people are always looking for consensus. So you need to go with these two things contemporaneously, but there needs to be the acceptance of new truths in a way, and the bank.
No. Yeah. I mean, I wasn't sorry, just to clarify, I wasn't thinking about global treaty. I was thinking more about this kind of solidarity that, becomes widespread. We are very compartmentalized at the moment, more and more closed in sections. So that worries precisely for this change of attitudes that you're talking about.
Can I?
So, I mean, how to change these cognitive frames. I mean, it would be interesting in looking at your analysis by area and seeing, you know, what is happening geographically.
Yes, I mean, the press that I've looked at, it includes some international press that has been translated into English from China for other places, but I haven't not looked at what is the debate in China or in Russia, for instance, or in other countries. So of course, but already if there is some discussion over these issues in Europe and in the US or in some other westernized country, then I think it's not a bad thing. Yeah, no, of course, it's not the solution. And also, I don't think that changing the narrative alone, it's definite in addressing all these issues, but it's one part of this big puzzle. Perhaps Joaquim wanted to say something.
No, I just wanted on this very important issue between from the connection between the global and the local. I think one important priority in all these, you know, issues are keep our economies open. We may revisit globalization, we may like other forms of globalization, but we need to keep our economies open because this is the only way to actually ensure prosperity over the long run. Now, most of the backlash against globalization in recent periods was actually a bottom-up movement. This issue of rural versus urban, etc. Why? Because these globalization shocks, and we have a lot now, a lot of evidence on that, are very differentiated across regions. Paul Krugman the other day was saying in a seminar that in West Virginia there was a furniture hub. Well, this thing was destroyed by the competition from China and other countries. Basically, it's extremely sort of concentrated. So I think it's very important indeed, if we want to keep our economies open, to deal with these issues at the local level. And it's true that our economic universe has shrunk. For the last 2 months, I have been my economic sort of universe, you know, it was shrunk, you know. So this local, the way dealing with these local issues, I think has become even more important now, in some sense, to address these global issues like keep our economies open. So the question that you addressed, I think, Simona, is a very important one. Because it's true that this geography of discontent was there and that generate a lot of sort of impacts in terms of the, you know, Elisa, of your sort of what you said about the narratives and the cognitive bias and the kind of this populist bias in many sort of in many countries. These come up from this geography of discontent. So this is a bottom-up sort of a process, right?
Yeah. Right, guys, I think that unfortunately we can stay here all day discussing. I would be very, very happy, but it's not possible. So I would give really 30 seconds each to this, I mean, for each speaker to give the main, I mean, what is the main worry, what is the main point they will focus on and invite other people to focus on, which is the priority for them. So let's start in reverse order. Elisa.
Me, I'm intrigued in understanding how you can hit two birds with a stone, that is reduce economic inequality and address sustainability challenges. I think companies and their geographical dispersion are key. And so you have to, when you think about policies, and development policies, you have to think about corporate governance policies as well, and distributive policies of companies as well. And this hasn't been done, in my view.
Thank you. Sergio.
Okay, so well, my last final, not question, but call is for this super talented community to help me understand how different, or how could we understand different sources of intra and interregional inequality. What could we learn from different processes, and how we can discuss and incorporate this into this really big discussion that is happening in the world in many different, from many different perspectives. And I think there is a lot of space to do that. We have the capability to do so, and I think I would like to see that. So that's my final comment.
Thank you. Joaquim.
Well, on my side, I think what I see is indeed an increasing relevance of the regional, urban, rural sort of analysis and policy in this complicated world. We have seen over the last sort of years this kind of a mounting interest in terms of the policymakers in the sort of a regional and urban sort of policy sort of areas. And I think with this crisis, if anything, this is going to increase. All the things we said about cities, these issues of density, the issue of globalization, all these would actually increase the business case for a better understanding of this sort of a granularity at the subnational level. So I think in some sense, this is also a sort of opportunity for us, which are in the community of regional economists, actually to play even stronger role in terms of better policy recommendations to our governments. This is my kind of my take. And at the OECD, this is clearly something that had changed over the last years.
I agree completely. So I still see questions coming, and at this point I would invite the Regional Studies Association to organize a workshop, a conference in the next future when we are free to move, in order to carry on this conversation. We will all carry on this conversation for sure. Let me thank the three fantastic speakers, Elisa, Sergio, Joaquim. Thank you so much for being here today, and thank you so much for everybody from all over the world, really, because for following us. And have a good day, goodbye, and still thinking to the future. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Simona. Bye.
Bye, thank you all.
Bye, thank you.